I feel a bit remiss that I haven't done certain things that I wanted to do. I wanted to read out dialogues that I've been having about various issues, which I thought were very good sort of primers on identity politics and things like that, because especially in dialogue, the certain issues crystallize very nicely. And, usually it's better than me just ranting and talking because I've actually uh, I've planned out my response to be comprehensive and to have a kind of uh, a flow, which is usually easier to kind of see the robustness of the position from more than one angle. Because at least when I'm writing responses, I'm able to create a kind of a 3D framework which looks much more substantial. But anyway, yeah, this is horribly going to just ramble on into a few different things, I guess. I've been talking to someone, uh, and we've been introducing, I guess, some of our thinking to each other, and so that's made me think that. I mean, the problem that I generally have is that I can sort of work on how to solve problems, and I'm very good at sort of in the immediate having an immediate need for something. Solving a particular intermediate challenge in terms of intellectual bridging, let's just say, it really puts things into view. And I found that I've actually structured quite a lot of my theory, or not, no, not so much theory, but at least in terms of how my theory relates to philosophy, I've been structuring my philosophy from the ground up. Um, which is quite valuable in terms of presentation. Because I mean, whenever I've tried to write a book on my psychology theories, I usually try to do it through philosophy, and it gets very dry, and without actually having someone going through it, uh, going through it for them. Uh, yeah, because I mean, yeah, this is an issue that I wanted to get into. Is that there's no objective linear progression. The best way I would say is to actually see where the other person is in terms of their own worldview and how they structure their beliefs and things like that. And that is itself also, there's so many things that you're not really capable of working with, and if there isn't a certain amount of patience and willingness to sort of fathom things that are quite laterally divergent from one's own, sort of starting position, it's somewhat problematic. But yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, because I mean, some of the themes that we were discussing was on the issue of objectivity itself, and usually this is something that I take to task, because usually when people have got something that they care about called objectivity, uh, it's quite a toxic word, even, like, what does it even mean? As if there is this, just sort of, there's this default objective idea, which is how everything operates, which is the system to which everything is framed, and it's just sort of, it's not fully understood, but it's understood that the individual or the mind is subservient to this objective framework, and so there is more of a master slave kind of presumption, which just helps settle one's worldview in some preordained sense. It's quite abject. But anyway, uh, he was describing to me a kind of heuristic, which sort of, he was technically laying it out, which was quite interesting. And I mean, I think it was useful, because I mean, I critiqued it in a way that it doesn't necessarily contradict that strategy, it's not necessarily a bad strategy, but I think that you have to, as long as you're aware of all the moves that you're doing as you're engaging in that heuristic, um, because that's the one thing I think heuristics do, is they sort of blunt sensitivity, and you can use any heuristic, any game, any ploy, so much as all the nuanced, kind of layers that are baked into it, that are going to make it incapable of having a direct purchase on something. Um, Obviously, everyone has to start from somewhere. That direct level of engagement is something that one is often trying to seek for and uncover within themselves in some sense, so that they can sort of find a confidence. I guess, yeah. So I tried to make it clear that I was not contradicting the point, but I was just sort of commenting on it, and trying to elaborate sort of greater other points. It would probably be better if I actually read it out rather than actually try to talk about it off the cuff. But let me just see what I can say about it that is somewhat generic, that I can extrapolate on a broader issue. So this is just almost to substantiate the point that there's no objective, sort of line of inquiry which really facilitates coming to a single understanding. It's sort of, some things just don't connect because the other person is just not looking for that sort of thing. They're not curious, they're not interested, they're not thirsty. And I mean, there's actually a parable in the scriptures that kind of references the seed, which finds rocky ground and shallow ground and is washed away by waters. And there's some seed that even starts to grow, but the ground is too shallow. And the seed is obviously the metaphor for the word, for an impression or a framework of the mind in some sense, because that is the seed that contains the pattern of life, so you can almost imagine that the seed that grows into a tree or a plant is almost the framework within the mind. These things always require such extravagant metaphor because it is sort of complicated and it is a mystery to be unlocked, and all those things. But let me think of a more generic issue here. So I was going to rant on about objectivity and say that there is a form of objectivity which is almost like the dynamics of subjectivity in some sense. That now I recall what I wanted to say. So there is a framework which is more solid than just relativistic subjectivity or something like that. So I was just going to articulate a point about how you can kind of reach that sort of that sense of there is a form of certainty which one can get from a subjective framework, which is all we are, is a subjective framework, but without presupposing an objectivity which comes from the exterior, but extending, made and fashioned from our subjective resources. We create a measure which does have certainty within it, but that certainty then has a dynamic involved in it. It's not an exterior objectivity. I remember I described a very nice sort of metaphor about persons and people, and how if you think that you are a person and you can only identify yourself as a mental image, um, as being part of a narrative, that you're effectively insane. You're not alive. You've surrendered your free will, or you have what was the word that I used? Your free will is dormant in that state, completely inert, unexercised. You have to be the thing that creates the person in your mind, that creates mental images. And although, in some sense, the medium that we use to communicate or do anything with is, in some sense, in the world, you will only ever relate to other identities. But if you see that the narrative, the source of that narrative, is from the subjective contention in some sense, then you can kind of communicate in such a way that you're employing these mental images, but you're also transcending that medium, but that it requires that people have the same understanding. So that there's a mutual transparency in terms of the you can only make like really stupid examples to illustrate this point, but obviously, like when you see, you can't use examples even because it's too ethereal and weird, that it doesn't really illustrate the point so strongly. But in the same sense that obviously when someone sends you a letter that has words written on it, you actually read them into thought. It's not an artifact of some it's not a very illustrative. I mean, that's the problem, is that you're dealing with something that is so immediate that its freedom has to be affected. Okay, so anyway, this is really the start of the subjectivity. So the start of the subjectivity is effectively not to relent the free will. So as soon as you've relented the free will to identities, then you're essentially looking to be enslaved by a system or a narrative in which you can essentially make your mental images correspond with with the motion that you're surrounded by in the world. And so you're basically just trying to root your mental images into the motion that you're perceiving and that you're influenced by, so that you've got like a one-to-one linear correlation, and that you can be taken by the narrative. You can sort of be taken away by the current, and you can be happily insane, and everything seems somewhat consistent. It's all going according to whatever expectation is part of that program, that just has this kind of causality, domino sort of progression within it, and there's no alternative. So there's nothing else to choose in that paradigm. But yeah, so what I'm going to say is technically not correct, but it exemplifies the abstract sort of principle which is correct. So if you so no, actually, I think you can be certain about this, or at least the principle behind the thinking of this. So the point is not to obsess over questions like this, like because I was thinking of forming the solution as a question, because it gets you on the right train of thought, as it were. What let me find it again now. So the bad form of the question is something like, what can't you be or do in order, what are you limited, what are you restricted from doing in order to be truly free, or to have free will? To have free will, what are you not permitted to do? What is forbidden for you to do? So now that whole sort of sentiment or question is in the narrative form. It's a poisonous question, because you're talking about things in a disembodied sense. Now let me show you the subjective certainty that kind of has the same subject matter involved with it. Is much more the question of, what are you forbidden from doing in order to consider yourself a contender of free will? Or what are you not permitted to do in order to consider yourself to have free will? So you see, like, that double barrel sort of thing. It's like, it makes it immediate, so it's like you're grounding it in terms of what your mind is capable of rationalizing. So the context of your answer has to be capable of sounding like it makes sense at the very least, and continuing to sound like it makes sense, perhaps with other things that sound like they make sense being consistent, internally coherent, and seeming to continue to make sense as a consortium, as a consort. And so you can imagine that there are different possibilities that your mind can contend with different sorts of things. It can be stochastic, it can be just kind of chaotically, just sort of moving from one subject to the next with no rhyme or reason. Or there could be one in which there is a golden thread, in which the same golden thread ties everything together, that there is a one good. The one good, that there isn't just this kind of, there's this myriad good that is now this one good then is the thing that is observing your immediate mental state, in some sense. You are giving it the right to judge your immediate mental state and the contents thereof and the objects thereof. And your mind is essentially tasked with the idea of just merely seeing what matches up and what doesn't match up. It's like, do these things go together or do they not go together? And the thing that it goes together with is the same one good. And so that one good essentially is like just the notion of consistent authority, in some sense, that it is the arbiter of one's judgment, and that one has a single judgment, a single genus of judgment, which might have different sub-capacities and faculties, but that it is a unity in some sense. And now, if you don't have recourse to that sense of authority, you're probably not worth communicating with for other people, because it's just going to be frustrating, because whatever progress is made, it just sort of, it's just like water off a duck's back. It's sort of, the context changes. It's sort of, it's a capricious sort of monster. And in some sense, it doesn't get to the point where now things can also be described in very, very myriad different ways. Like the the hardest part really in talking to someone else is the translation, the use of language, the specific style of the individuals, how they make meaning, and how perhaps difficult it is to talk about the sort of the core machinery, especially if the mind is tangled in mental images and things like that, and it can't even distinguish between, let's say, real immediate empirical observations about consciousness, because that is the most immediate grounding subject. That is the only common ground that can ever exist, in fact. And what is it capable of supporting, and what level of depth can be read into it, and what sophistication is it capable of preserving and maintaining and sustaining in terms of the structures that can be read. And it's weird because, as you try to describe it, at the same time, you're not only just describing it. In fact, you're never describing it. You're describing the understanding of it, and you're comparing and contrasting perhaps the best way to contend an understanding about it. And this is the difference between the mental image and the actual life of a free will, and a free will which has to be able to deal with those mental images, to deal through them, to deal with them as its medium, as its emissary, and the Word was made flesh, it says in John. And it's interesting because actually the flesh is really not such a bad thing to live with. It's just not something that you should live through, but it is something that you have to live with. And in fact, it is how the spirit has recourse to the record of its actions, the past tense of its actions, which are its resource in some sense. And that resource is something that is completely open to being unfolded further and changed and altered. It's always capable of being altered. There are lots of things that can be said about time. There are lots of ways in which I can talk about things about psychology that, in terms of how to actualize certain things that really have to do with how to conceive time relative to consciousness, and with how to understand time within consciousness. Which has a lot of I guess when I go into issues like this, it doesn't seem interesting to people because they don't understand the precise use of and connotation, and how it's built into an elaborate, consistent, sort of rubric, as it were. Oh, it actually is part of a fully sort of informed worldview that's capable of actually contending itself in good faith. I did actually make a very good description about that form of good faith. I might just read that one line. read that one line. That'll be the last thing I do. Where did I put that? No. Here it is. This is really the only juggling act, how to garner knowledge while operating within a tentative and fundamentally ad hoc belief structure, which is fueled exclusively by your election to follow it. So I was just like summarizing that is the kind of the crux that most people, how they would generally confront the problem of being a seeker, but still contending knowledge that is growing. So what is the character of that knowledge that is growing? And then actually I should probably read some of the other stuff. There's so much repetition though. It might only make sense in the context. In some sense, in the world, we are only identities to one another, but if we trace how we actively choose to deploy those identities and know about their interrelatedness with the underlying source of actualization, communication can transcend the medium of deployment via narrative frameworks, although this is only possible when people have the same frame of mind, i.e. the same understanding. When understanding cannot disassociate itself with the mental images, identities, narratives, then the person is basically only a person. They are not an yourself. They are not an yourself at all. Persons need to root their mental images into a system of identities, narratives, and mental images, which is exactly what being insane is. They live within their own minds only. They are not alive even. Their free will is totally dormant. So, just to underline it, I'm trying to sort of make a definitional distinction that if you are yourself, you have recourse essentially to being able to change the person who you are by your own postulate, whereas you can't do that if you see yourself as fundamentally being a person, as being that mental image. And so, the start of my understanding framework is that it's done via free will, that it's a free act. Yeah, the other stuff is particular to the discussion that I was having, which tries to go into a good example of how when you're being employed by a heuristic, you, anyway, when you're using a strategy,